This is Fred Radley's AS Media Music Magazine Evaluation. Question 1. In what ways does your media product use, develop or challenge forms and conventions of real media products? I'm just going to introduce my magazine. This is XLR. It's an electronic music magazine, and it basically focuses on the production side and technology aspects of music production, as well as lots of up-and-coming artists and some already quite established artists in the electronic dance music scene. Takes influences from Enemy, Clash, Q Magazine, and this is because they're kind of more retro feel magazines. They're quite clean, quite graphically, aesthetically pleasing to look at. They're not overcrowded with adverts and colours, not too garish. And this is something I decided to go with because I felt it just worked well with the actual genre I was aiming for. And this kind of goes against some of the conventions of magazines such as Kerrang, which is more rocky and gothic, and also Mojo, which also tends to have a lot of bright covers. So getting into the conventions, my iFlow on the cover of my magazine is pretty conventional. It starts from the top left hand corner at the masthead and swoops down past the face of the main character and the main feature headline and goes right down to the bottom right hand corner. This is something you'll see in lots of other magazines because they want the audience to be able to see what's going on and who's in the magazine. And you'll see this here in Mojo with a blue line just coming down here, the exact same thing. Looking at some other conventions, I've decided to compare my magazine to an old edition of NME, and this because it was one of the main influences of my work, and I just thought the original NME magazine was really nice. So as you can see, they both have a main character. Their face is kind of directly approaching addressing the audience, and something that kind of draws the reader in quite a lot. Then also we have the masthead at the top left hand corner. This is pretty conventional, normally the biggest piece of text on the page, and normally in a different font or colour, just to signify that this is the title of the magazine. Then also got the main feature headline, both of them slightly smaller than the masthead, but still jumps out at the reader, so they know this is the main feature of this magazine. Then also some other smaller headlines, and finally some extra things just to draw in any other readers. Something you didn't see on the Enemy magazine, but you will see in most modern magazines, is a barcode. And conventionally, a barcode will be at the bottom right hand corner, which is circled in red here on the Kerrang issue. But on my magazine, I decided to put it in the top right hand corner, and the reason for this was because I just felt it fit in better with the actual style of the magazine itself. It looked better on the page. So moving on to the contents page, my contents page is actually pretty conventional. There's nothing that's actually out of the ordinary here. It's a little bit simplified, but it's conventional in all the things, in all its features. So here I've compared it to an Enemy contents page, and here you can see it says Enemy this week, and then that's to signify this is the contents page. On my page, fairly similarly, I've got the title of the magazine, and I've got the content saying inside here, a bit lower between on the other side of the photo. The next thing you'll notice is the actual contents itself. This is conventional as well. You'll see this in most music magazines, a list chronologically of everything that's going on in the magazine, with the page numbers as well. Here I've circled the image on the Enemy contents page, and interestingly, on this Enemy contents page, it's quite unconventional in the fact that there's only one image, or maybe that's two images of the same thing going on. I'm not entirely sure. Normally what you'll see, which you can see in my magazine here, is a wall of images, and this is normally just to draw the reader in more to see what pages they might be interested in seeing. And normally it will tell you the page number of this image, where you can find what this article is about. Finally, the last thing I'm going to talk about on my contents page that's quite conventional is the bits of kind of synergy and media convergence that the magazines try and use on this page. They'll often advertise maybe subscribing to their magazine or their website, and this is what I've done, and you can see this here down at the Enemy article as well. Slightly unconventional, but I think very effective. In the Enemy table of contents, you can also see on the left hand side circled here is a band index, and it's something they do. They tell you where you can find each band on which page. I thought this was really interesting. I tried it out on my page, but because of the way it looked and it kind of clumped up the page a bit, I decided not to. But personally, I think this is actually a really helpful tool, and something that actually probably will come a lot more into effect in a lot of magazines in the future, I think. So moving on to my 4-page spread, this is just an idea of what the final product of my 4-page spread, and just look at some conventions. So in this Q magazine, you can see Jay-Z. Conventionally, a lot of the time you'll see on the left-hand side of the page, you'll see a big image of the artist, the artist of the feature, and often it'll be a direct address to the audience, and this kind of draws them in a bit. And so you see Jay-Z's face looking straight at them. Another thing you might see a lot of times, a big bit of writing telling the audience who this person is, what this page is going to be. So here we can see the house style of Q actually is normally they always have the first initial of the artist in like a big red letter behind the text. That's something that Q always do. In mine, similarly, in some ways, you know, you've got, although I've got a long shot instead of a close-up of my two artists, they're still kind of confronting the audience and kind of drawing them in this kind of mysterious way. And the main reason I did that was because there's two of them. It's hard to get a close-up of two of them and not make it look a bit weird on a single A4 page. Also here, you know, big writing telling the reader who the artist is. The artist is jovial, so you know the reader straight away knows this is who they are. Another convention of double-page spreads is having a big quote on the first page. I decided to actually go against this in my article because I felt that there wasn't a specific place on the page where I thought it'd really fit in. But instead, I kept a stand first, which is something where a magazine will introduce who the article was about, which you can see here in a Mojo interview, and that's what I've done here, circled in red. Some other conventions, you often see drop caps, which is basically the first letter, the first word of the first sentence is in big letters, and this is just to show, it's in one big letter, and this is just to show to the reader this is where the article starts. And some other things here, just in the top right hand corner, you'll often see a little note just to show the reader this is the main feature. It says here ones to watch. And finally, on this page, you can also see they credit the words and photography always on the page somewhere. So here you can see drop cap circled there in red. Top right hand corner, you can see XL exclusive, and bottom left hand corner circled in red, the words and photography by Fred Radley. So here we've got another article on Meek Mill, and what you can see here is that they've placed an image in between the text, and this is really conventional in double-page spreads or 4-page spreads. There'll be images within the text, and the text will be around it, just to draw the reader in more, to make them want to read on, to make them get a better idea of the artist. So here's what I've done: put images around the text, circled in red there. Finally, just to point out some other things that I've gone against in the conventions, you'll often see the text. So the text here is in purple, and this fits in really well with the image because the image is kind of bluey purple, and it kind of keeps the same colour schemes throughout the article. And same here, Tiny Temper's wearing red shoes, and he's got kind of grey on his jacket and stuff. So the article has grey and red writing on it. Very typical of double-page spreads or 4-page spreads. But in fact, in my article, the house style of my whole magazine is very simple. It's black and white and occasionally grey text. And so here, although the images are green and kind of dull blacks, you don't really see that in the text at all. So yeah. Question 2, how does your media product represent particular social groups? Well, my media product is basically there to represent the kind of new age of bedroom producers and people who can make music wherever they are in the world. And it's a really big thing. You know, you get SoundCloud, which is a website for sharing your music, and it's a very easy, very quick, very fast-paced kind of thing. And also this links in with things like websites like Tumblr, which is a photo sharing website, and AS Evauation, which is a fashion website that also kind of links in with music. And this is something I've actually linked into my magazine. There's articles on art, and there's their favourite new fashion, and this kind of they all link together with this kind of culture. It represents this kind of youth culture. I've also incorporated that through my advert, which is for Sock Apparel, which is a brand of my friends. I went and took some photos of him wearing his clothes, and yeah, that kind of fits in with it. It also represents kind of the youth who are going out and, you know, really into nightlife, seeing people DJing live, things like that. And yeah, Rise of the Bedroom Producer there, which is a recent documentary, and that is the kind of idea that people can be at home making music of their own on Logic, which is a software, and Ableton Live, which is another one. And I mean, overall, the kind of things that these people will be interested in, things like Boiler Room, which is a kind of internet streaming website where they get big, like the biggest underground electronic dance music artists, and they'll do live sets, live DJ sets, and they stream out to thousands of people, even though there's only 20 people in the room, and it's kind of a whole live experience kind of thing. Also, a documentary called #Don't Call It Post Dubstep, which is made by Red Bull. This kind of also explains the whole culture of this kind of post dubstep electronic dance music scene that's going on. Another thing that I think about the people that it's representing, it's actually quite a male audience. I think there's a lot of women who would be reading the magazine, but in general, you know, producing tracks at home and listening to other people's producing tracks, it seems to be quite a male thing. I think this has also been influenced by YouTube channels who upload lots of different people's music, and they have thousands and thousands of subscribers. You know, there's like 1 million views on this video, and the way they advertise their videos is by putting kind of scantily clad women in the backgrounds, and this is probably one of the reasons why it's quite a male genre, the kind of dance music thing in the UK and even out in Europe and America. So yeah, and other magazines that you can expect the same kind of people to be interested in, you know, Mix Mag, and of course the online RA Resident Advisor, which pretty much contains almost the exact same kind of content as my magazine. It has album reviews, single reviews, podcasts, event reviews, tech reviews, so it's got things like Native Instruments, and a DJ chart. So this is exactly the kind of thing, exactly kind of culture that it kind of represents. So question 3 is, who would the target audience of your media product be? And kind of just to reiterate, it's the same kind of crowd. It's people who are interested in life. It's kind of 15 to 35-year-old men and women, but majority men. And it's the kind of people who, you know, can afford to pay for a magazine, pay £3 or £4 for a magazine, and spend their time making tunes and listen to other people's tunes. And it's kind of bedroom producers as well. People use SoundCloud. So question 4 is, what kind of media institution would distribute your magazine? And without a doubt, I think Future PLC would be the perfect institute. And the reason for this is that they release, they have a lot of brands which are kind of technology and arts based. So they have kind of computer music, which is really similar, has elements of that in my magazine, as well as Future Music, which is basically a similar magazine, but even more kind of artist based than computer music. And obviously Rhythm, another kind of musician's guide kind of thing. And they also have brands with film and festivals and computer arts as well. And I think you could use synergy and media convergence and all of these things to kind of advertise each other. So, you know, computer arts could advertise my magazine because it's the same kind of people who are going to be doing Logic, Ableton Live. They're also going to be using Photoshop. They're also going to be using all these things to make their art. It's kind of quite a connected circle of culture. Question 5 is, how do you attract your audience? Well, I mean, to attract my audience, I had kind of a couple of things I needed to get, and, you know, to start, I needed the cover to look as kind of cool as the artists that would be inside were. So I decided not to make it so overly complicated, not loads of flashy colours. I want it to be like slick, so nice text. You know, the font I use, Roboto, is very clean, very clear, and the masthead is quite an interesting, artistic looking logo. So this kind of appeals to this kind of crowd of people. Also, I just kept, when I edited the colours, I didn't leave it with kind of overexposure and things like this. I wanted to look quite slick, quite blurred in the background, but very, very high focus on the front character. And also things like smoking a cigarette. In some ways, although this isn't overly noticeable, in some ways, the fact that he's smoking a cigarette will kind of appeal to this kind of crowd of people. The kind of smoke, they go out, they drink, but it's that kind of culture that comes with the music itself. What have you learnt about your technologies from the process of constructing this product? Well, I'm just going to now go through all the little tools that I learnt when I was doing this project, and I ended up using, actually, I think three or four different, three different softwares, and this was just due to kind of complications with being able to afford them. I mean, obviously, I used InDesign, which is expensive, so I ended up using a trial for that. Although I had enough time to get all except for one page of my magazine done on that, and I used Photoshop for the images, and I ended up using Word as well, just for some of the more simple stuff. So here is just all the images. I took about 100 and something images, and then I picked the select best few and started editing them on Photoshop. So I began editing this image by adding a high contrast layer. I then experimented with the levels of the image by adding levels layer and changing the input and output of red and blue in the image, so kind of changing the colours. Then added a hue and saturation layer, changing the lightness to create a vintage effect as seen in the June Bride's enemy cover that I showed earlier on. I then used the blur tool to change the depth of the focus to make my friend standing in the front a more central element of the image. This also gave the image a more slick feel. And the same kind of tools used to make my advert. It was just a simple photo. I changed the contrast and the exposure and things like this, and the color and the saturation to end up with this product. So my 4-page spread, I began and I did this in InDesign actually. I began creating my 4-page spread by placing my main images into 2 double-page templates in Adobe InDesign. Then pasted parts of my interview with the featured band into each page of a single column text box. I then resized the box to fit the margins that I wanted on the page. I then split the whole text into 2 columns. I then began editing the spacing between the questions in the interview and changing the styles and the sizes of the fonts used, and this was Roboto I used for the font. I then added a text box to create the headline of the article. Then spanned the stand first of the interview to experiment with the text layout, but I then added some other images between the text to keep the reader interested. I then actually decided not to keep the stand first spread across 2 and kept it in 1 column, but then I added a drop cap to the article using the drop cap tool. Then changed the size of the certain areas of text to create a quote. I then created a box template to put page numbers at the bottom of each page, and I just copied and pasted these into each page and changed the numbers in them. Then added a text box with a black outline to show the reader that this was the main feature, just like the James Blake article I showed before. Then added text informing the reader of the author and photographer of the article. And these kind of tools were used in the same way in XLR. I went on a barcode generator online and put the barcode into my page, and so that's the final product. For my contents page, at this point I actually no longer had access to InDesign, and so what I did with this is I actually used Word. And initially my table of contents was very different to my final table of contents, but I used the same tools nonetheless. So my trial of InDesign ran out, doing Word. I began creating my table of contents by adding a text box into Word using the font of my masthead, which is called Delta Ray, and adding the date, etc. in Roboto Light. I then placed a second text box beneath and started writing out the content of my magazine and page numbers. I then accidentally came across this quite nice blue effect from accidentally just highlighting the whole page, and I decided this was something I might just try out with the magazine. So I experimented with the colours and experimented putting different kinds of boxes around the text. I then also experimented with taking other images that I'd taken and changing the colour saturation, which is a tool you can use on Word, and it actually looked too inconsistent with the styles of photo, so I kind of scrapped this idea, but I wanted to have a wall of images at the bottom, but they just looked a bit out of place with the rest of the magazine. So that was my initial first draft, and I finished this by stretching the original image over the whole page and let the text kind of obstruct it, so it kind of gave this kind of stylish ambiguity, which is what I described up here. But yeah, as you saw the final contents page. But yeah, like before, you saw what actually the final product was, and I just used the same tools. So yeah. So looking back at your preliminary task, what do you feel you've learnt in the progression from it to the full product? Well, I mean, this is my original product, and this is what we did quite quickly and without really many skills, and we did this on Photoshop actually. And I think I think the main thing I've learned is I've learned to use a whole new software, and that's the most important thing here, which is that I've actually learned to use a really complicated software like InDesign, and I've learned to use it really effectively. And this took me a long time to do on Photoshop. I not only learned to do Photoshop, but I've now learned to use InDesign, two of the biggest designing graphics softwares you can get. So yeah, I mean, some other things that I've learned is kind of more conventions of magazines. So I wasn't aware of how complicated and how many different conventions there are in a magazine. I thought it was just kind of you make it up in your head and you put it down, but actually there's so many things that you need to kind of stick to, and so many small little things you have to mess around with to get your magazine looking right. And these are things like just the alignment of the text, which is actually a tricky thing to do, and like just the spacing of the layout and things like that. And this is actually something that it's something that you actually have to take a long time to look at other magazines to learn. So I think that's kind of also one of the main things that I've learned from the preliminary task. And that's my media evaluation. Thanks for listening.